Obviously a tragic situation right now, but in terms of the response, what are you seeing at the moment from an Australian perspective, and how we are comparing to some other countries around the world?
I think if we look at what other countries are doing in response to this huge humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan, uh, only really one thing characterises Australia's response, and that's too little, too late. Obviously, there's millions, if not more, of people trying to flee Afghanistan. We saw those horrific scenes at Kabul airport, and the federal government has been warned for months now by ADF troops and many others, including the Australia Institute, about this exact situation unfolding, and that it had to do more to get people who assisted the Australian forces, people with family in Afghanistan, to get them out before this kind of situation eventuated. And, they didn't do enough. That's the cold, hard truth. And now the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is more or less saying that's as good as they can do. We saw that flight out yesterday with only 26 people on it, which is heartbreaking given the scenes that we've seen. And Australia obviously has huge obligations here. It's Australia's longest war. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. Some Australian troops are alleged to have war crimes in this country. Our humanitarian obligation is huge, and our response is really quite cruel. There's obviously people who are trapped there who helped Australian forces and now can't get out, or it's going to be extremely difficult to get them out. And here in Australia, we've got around 4,000 refugees who are here under temporary protection visas, and the Prime Minister gave them absolutely no hope of getting permanent protection, or that their families might be able to join them here. So in comparison to countries like Canada and the UK that have massively lifted their humanitarian visa response, up to 20,000 people coming in for Canada and the UK, Australia's response looks deliberately cruel by comparison.
How have you seen the way that the US has made this move? Of course, there are a lot of people saying that the war needs to be fought by the country itself, by the people within the country of Afghanistan, and we needed to move out at some point. Many criticising how it has been managed. What's your take?
Yeah, look, I think those critics were right. At the beginning of the war, many people warned that this was not a good military venture. And part of the reason for that, as my colleague Alan Beam at the Australia Institute says, is because one of the objectives was to root out terrorism and prevent Al Qaeda from operating in Afghanistan. Terrorism is inherently a political movement. It cannot be defeated by military force, and that's exactly what we've seen. After 20 years, the Taliban is back in control of Afghanistan. So the objectives failed, but here at the end, I think the observation that some are making is there was no exit strategy. There just was an exit from Allied forces, and we're seeing the results now. But more than that, I think it real failure of intelligence from the US, as well as policy. So I think people have been caught by how quickly all the various regional cities and then Kabul fell, and potentially they should have had better intelligence on that and allowed people to prevent the kind of situations that we've seen. But we are where we are now, and now we need a humanitarian response. And as I said, the Australian federal government's response certainly looks cruel by comparison to the response from other countries.
Let's turn our attention back to another major situation. It is a challenging time at the moment, isn't it, for so many people? Of course, Sydney, New South Wales in lockdown, Melbourne, Victoria. What's your latest take and reading on how we're managing the situation here when it comes to the pandemic?
Yeah, well, like I said, it looks like a bit too little too late on Afghanistan. And I think that same logic to the federal government's vaccine rollout, too little too late. And, we are seeing deteriorating numbers, I think, or worse numbers in New South Wales, Victoria. The ACT numbers have ticked up as well. And the response from the New South Wales government really just seems to be to keep repeating this line, to go and get vaccinated, instead of concrete, practical solutions to prevent the barriers to vaccination for some people. Now, partly the federal government is to blame for there not being enough supply for the vaccine rollout. But, you know, the New South Wales government could be looking at specific workplaces, what can be done to get vaccinations to certainly the essential workforce that has to be at work to keep the economy rolling, to keep food in the grocery stores, those kinds of things. And we're just not seeing that level of detail. It's just this repeated, can the community please do more? Can they start doing the right thing? What we need to be seeing are more concrete and practical solutions. There's got to be, you know, for example, the information on the government's website about COVID that's in languages other than English is months out of date. There's loads of things that we could be doing to improve this situation that just aren't being done. And it's a real concern because, you know, we're seeing outbreaks now, not only in other states, but in New Zealand. The Sydney outbreak has spread to now, and also really concerningly into Aboriginal communities in Western New South Wales. And that's a real failure of policy because we know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are amongst the most vulnerable populations. Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations have done a world-leading job at protecting their communities from this virus. And now, at the last minute, when the vaccine is available, when these communities, we were told, were a priority, we're seeing that the vaccination rates in many Indigenous communities are half that of the general population. It's not good enough and is a failure of government, not necessarily of those communities. So I think there's a lot that the government, both at a federal and the state level in New South Wales, could be doing, and we're just not seeing it. So for the next couple of weeks, it certainly feels like things are getting more out of control, not less.
Yeah, it's a really challenging time and our leaders really need to step up at the moment. There's no doubt about that. The spotlight is on, not just here in Australia, but around the world. And this is the time where they need to step up. Ebony, thanks for your insight once again. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.